The Reveries of the Solitary Walker. Translated with preface, notes, and an interpretive essay by Charles E. Butterworth. Jean-Jacques Rousseau. To Billy, who prized valor most. March 30, 1946. January 11th, 1967. Preface. Shortly after Jean-Jacques Rousseau died on July 2nd, 1778, 2 notebooks filled with his handwriting were found among his personal effects. Unlike most of the other notebooks and papers he left behind, these had been partially edited. What is more, the material in these 2 notebooks had been organized in the form of a book of essays and assigned a title by Rousseau, The Reveries of the Solitary Walker. This work, consisting of 9 finished essays or walks and a long paragraph introducing a 10th walk, is Rousseau's last. According to the chronology outlined in the second walk, it was only shortly before October 1776 that he decided to compose these essays. The 10th walk opens with the declaration that it is being written on Palm Sunday in 1778, that is, a few weeks before his death. However, the significance of the Reveries derives from the intrinsic quality of the essays, not from its status as Rousseau's last work. It is important to identify the Reveries as his last work only to place the uniqueness of his arguments into proper perspective and to alert the reader to the difficulties connected with presenting an accurate version of the text. Because the Reveries of the Solitary Walker seems at first to be so similar to all of Rousseau's other works, the suggestion that it is unique may meet with disbelief. Yet despite a superficial similarity with other writings, it is ultimately quite different from them. Although it is autobiographical, as are many of his other writings, it is not apologetic. In the first walk, for example, Rousseau characterizes these essays as a sort of sequel to the Confessions, and then speaks about himself throughout the rest of the book with the candor that is so characteristic of the Confessions and the dialogues. But he never seeks to plead his uniqueness or to establish his ultimate worth as he did in those other works. The portrait he sketches of himself in the Reveries allows us to understand Rousseau, the thinker, far more thoroughly than do the self-portraits of the Confessions and dialogues. Similarly, while the Reveries is written in rich and gentle prose, while it is captivating and positively lyrical at times, it is never as sentimental or as passionate as his other works. Finally, even though questions about politics, human nature, God, ultimate happiness, and nobility of lying are raised in this work, as is in his other writings, they are answered differently here. For example, in the course of the inquiry into the grounds for his religious beliefs in the third walk, a very obscure reference is made to the relationship between his own beliefs and those set forth in the Emile as the profession of faith of the Savoyard vicar. Despite the tendency students of Rousseau have to cite this reference as proof that the Savoyard vicar's profession of faith is the same as Rousseau's, the reference is really not all that conclusive. Apart from the problem that the argument of the larger context in which the profession of faith of the Savoyard vicar occurs, that is, the Emile, runs completely counter to the vicar's statement, there is the additional problem that in the Reveries, Rousseau never states what his own beliefs are. Moreover, in the immediately preceding walk, Rousseau makes a declaration about the nature of God which cannot be reconciled with the vicar's statements about God's nature. It seems then that the real point of the reference is to draw a sharper distinction between his own position and the one he set forth for others in his earlier writings. Examples such as these could be multiplied, and they will be considered extensively in the interpretive essay. The reason for alluding to them here is to buttress the claim for the uniqueness of the Reveries, and to suggest that this uniqueness is related to the status of the Reveries as Rousseau's last work. Because of the discussions in his work, frequently return to problems serious critics had already observed in his thinking, and present his views in a new light, it is hard to escape the impression that Rousseau intended this work as a final statement of his thought. By presenting the Reveries of the Solitary Walker as something he wrote to read over to himself in his old age, Rousseau endowed it with a special veneer of spontaneity and frankness, indicative of a final accounting. Yet by describing these essays as the pastime of a lonely old man, and by exposing his thought more through allusions and elliptical suggestions than through direct arguments, he was able to remain as discreet as ever in his last statement. The other consideration calling for the recognition of the Reveries as Rousseau's last work is that it is unfinished, and consequently never benefited from his meticulous attention to the details of publishing. The Reveries of the Solitary Walker was first published in 1782 through the joint efforts of three of Rousseau's friends, the Marquis de Girardin, Paul Moltau, and Pierre Alexandre de Peyroux. Unfortunately, that edition is marred by careless errors, as well as by numerous false readings. Many of the latter can be traced to incorrect readings of the manuscript, to attempts of Many of the latter can be traced to incorrect readings of the manuscript, to attempts to improve Rousseau's style, and to clearly erroneous understanding of the sense of certain passages. In spite of these defects, the text of the 1782 edition was reprinted a number of times in France and in Switzerland from the last years of the 18th century through the first half of the 20th, until 1948, when two critical editions based on new examinations of Rousseau's manuscript appeared. It was the only text available. That year, John S. Spinks edition was published by Didier in Paris, while Marcel Raymond's was published by Droz in Geneva. Apparently neither scholar was aware of the work pursued by the other, with two notable exceptions. Raymond's edition subsequently served as the basis for more than a dozen other publications of the Reveries. Henry Rodier went back to the manuscript to establish the text of his edition, which was published by Garnier in 1960. and Silvestre de Sasse's attempt to establish a critical edition by utilizing the different editions of Spink, Raymond and Rodier, as well as Raymond's second edition of the text for the Pléiades series in 1959, was published by Gallimard in the Livre de Poche series in 1965. All of this publishing activity notwithstanding, there is to date no edition of the Reveries which is completely faithful to Rousseau's manuscript. Although the Reveries has been translated into English as well as into Danish, Swedish, Romanian, Italian, and even into Korean, Chinese, and Turkish, none of these translations has called forth a more accurate text. The English translation of the Reveries, based on the 1782 edition, was published in New York by Brentanos about 50 years ago. In addition to carrying over into English the errors contained in the 1782 edition, this translation is flawed by the translator's persistent efforts to rewrite Rousseau's prose. The order of words used in apposition is inverted. Some of the words used in an enumeration are dropped, and Rousseau's paragraphs are reconstructed. Moreover, any attempt to acquire a clear comprehension of Rousseau's argument is hampered by the translator's inconsistent handling of key terms, strange rendering of idiomatic expressions, and confusion annotations. The present translation was undertaken to present in English a text that would be faithful to the letter and spirit of Rousseau's manuscript, a text that would render the meaning of the Reveries accurately without sacrificing too much of the beauty of Rousseau's prose. To arrive at the best possible version of Rousseau's original text, the unique manuscript of the Reveries was carefully examined and compared with the existing critical editions. In Appendix A, the manuscript has been described quite extensively, and some of the notes to the translation identify manuscript readings missing in the existing editions. As is only proper for a faithful rendering of Rousseau's thought, his paragraphing has been scrupulously respected throughout the text. However, while no question arose about how to handle Rousseau's paragraphs, there were many questions about how to handle his punctuation within paragraphs. In addition to differences between French and English conventions for punctuation, there are differences between Rousseau's own style of punctuation and that normally adhered to in French. The punctuation of the manuscript has nevertheless been followed in the translation as much as good sense would allow. When it appeared that Rousseau's style and thought could be better communicated by breaking his long sentences into shorter ones, or by transforming his dependent clauses into independent clauses, that was done. With respect to the actual task of translating, the goal has been to transmit the sense of Rousseau's prose and of his exceptional style. Still, that goal is more easily stated than attained. In the inevitable conflicts between accuracy and felicity of expression, the former always prevailed. Every effort has been made, for example, to translate key words in a consistent manner, even when such lexical fidelity resulted in less than lyrical English. Notes have been added to help the reader understand the text. Some explain the way certain words have been translated, or the way the text has been altered to approximate better English usage. Others identify places, plants, persons, and literary allusions. In addition, occasional references in the text to events in Rousseau's life have been amplified in the notes by indicating how the event was explained in the Confessions. Moreover, Appendix B contains a translation of the way Rousseau discussed his stay on St. Peter's Island in the Confessions. Allusions in the Reveries to events and periods of time in Rousseau's life are so numerous that a brief account of his life might be helpful. Generally speaking, his activities and accomplishments can be divided into 7 different epochs. Such a division does not accord with Rousseau's division of the Confessions into 12 books, because his account of his life in the Confessions was intended as an explanation of how his sentiments developed rather than as a sequential enumeration of the various events in that full and tumultuous life. And because he finished writing the Confessions almost a decade before his death. Rousseau's childhood and early adolescence in Geneva correspond to the first epoch, 1712 to 1728, while the period of his growth into manhood and close relationship with Mime de Warens, 1728, corresponds 1728 to 1742 corresponds to the second. Rousseau's childhood and early adolescence in Geneva correspond to the first epoch, 1712 to 28, while the period of his growth into manhood and close relationship with Mime de Warens, 1728 to 1742, corresponds to the second. The early years of his Parisian sojourn, 1742 to 49, appear to belong to a third epoch of his life and the period of his growing discontent with Parisian society, along with the period of his moral reform, 1750 to 1756, to a fourth. Those years of solitary existence on the outskirts of Paris, until the events following the publication of the Emile, forced him to flee from France, 1756 to 1762, seemed to form another clear division in his life. Book 12 of the Confessions covers the troubled years in Switzerland and ends in 1765, with Rousseau being forced to leave St. Peter's Island. Those years, together with the time of his sojourn in England and his wanderings in France, until his return to Paris in 1770, seem to constitute a sixth epoch. The final division covers the period of his life from his return to Paris until he began to write the Reveries. Geneva was the center of Rousseau's life from the time of his birth on June 28, 1712, to his precipitate departure shortly before his 16th birthday. The death of his mother within a few days of his birth and his father's forced exit from Geneva under unfavorable conditions about 10 years later deprived Rousseau of a normal family life. For about 2 years after his father left Geneva, Rousseau and a cousin of his age were sent as boarding pupils to the Lambercier family just outside Geneva. See Third Walk. When the 2 boys were brought back to Geneva, Rousseau was apprenticed to the city clerk. The unsatisfactory character of this arrangement quickly became apparent to all parties, and shortly before Rousseau's 13th birthday he was apprenticed to an engraver. According to the poignant accounts of the Confessions, the next 3 years were among the unhappiest of his life. Several months of dejection, and his life in Geneva ended in 1728 with the closing of the city gates as he was returning from a walk, since he had been locked out of the city on previous occasions and had been threatened with severe punishment by his master should he be locked out again. Rousseau decided to strike out on his own. During the next 14 years, Rousseau grew to manhood and began the difficult task of self-instruction. Ribald episodes and youthful adventures filled the first 7 years, while the latter 7 were given over to general withdrawal, quiet meditation, and extensive study. But whatever his activities or projects during these years, they centered around Mime de Warens, the lady to whom he had been directed immediately after leaving Geneva. See 10th Walk. His attachment to her grew during this period from something resembling filial affection to deeper feelings of tenderness and love. According to Rousseau, it was for her sake that he went to Turin and converted to the Roman Catholic faith, and after having been chased from the household staff of one noble family in Turin, Seaforth Walk, only to be taken into the household of another noble Tarascon family, and assured of a promising career as its diplomatic emissary. The desire to see Mem de Warens prompted him to abandon present security and future glory, and to return to her in Annecy. A peaceful year with Mem de Warens was then followed by about a year and a half of carefree wanderings and extravagant escapades. Rousseau's foot Rousseau's foot voyages took him to Lyon and even to Paris, while his escapades included a brief stint as interpreter to a fake archimandrite, who claimed to have been sent to Switzerland for the purpose of raising money to rebuild the Holy Sepulchre, and a painfully funny attempt to pass himself off in Lausanne as a music teacher from Paris. Growing more serious as the age of 20 approached, Rousseau returned to Mem de Warens, who was then living in Chambéry. For the next few years he worked assiduously at learning music and gradually broadened his interest to include the study of history, literature, philosophy, mathematics, and natural science. On at least two occasions, Rousseau referred to the 5 or 6 years from about 1735 until 1740, spent mainly in Chambéry and at a country house in the nearby valley of Les Charmettes, as among the happiest of his life. They were years of relative calm and of deep study, little else, but the joy of this period was doomed to be short-lived. 2 brief periods of separation persuaded Rousseau that the only way for him to maintain his deep affection for Mem de Warens was to live far away from her. That conclusion was followed by the decision to go to Paris, where for about 7 years he sought in vain to make a place for himself. His first efforts at gaining recognition centered around the novel method he had devised for writing musical scores with numbers. Although the project was sound, Rousseau was unable to persuade the Academy of Sciences or the general public that it should be adopted, and thus turned his attention to other activities. Among these was a post as secretary to the French ambassador to Venice, which he was forced to resign after serving less than a year because of violent arguments with the ambassador. When he returned to Paris following his diplomatic interlude, he felt more confident about his talent for musical composition, and devoted all his efforts to finishing an opera he had been working on for some time. Completed in 1745, The Gallant Muses was considered for the Paris Opera, but Rousseau anticipated its rejection and withdrew it to make revisions. Whatever the problems in this work, His knowledge of music was sufficiently recognized that he was invited to write the articles on music for the Encyclopédie by its co-editor, Diderot, with whom he had formed a cordial friendship. At about this time he entered into the lasting relationship with Thérèse Levasseur, which was formalized by marriage almost 25 years later. For the most part, however, this was a period of frustration and thwarted ambition. It ended with the sudden inspiration that prompted the fervent prose and unconventional pronouncements of the Discourse on the Sciences and the Arts, otherwise known as the First Discourse. Awarded a prize in 1750 and published the following year, the First Discourse won Rousseau immediate recognition, either because of his engaging style or because he had dared to criticize the arts and scientists in the citadel of the Enlightenment. Rousseau was so besieged by reputations that it took him 2 years to respond to the best of them. All the while he continued to compose music, and his efforts resulted in the village soothsayer, performed before the king at Fontainebleau in October 1752, and then at the Paris Opera about 6 months later. It was received with overwhelming acclaim. The famous preface to his play, Narcissus, in which he attempted to show that his criticism of the arts was consistent with his own participation in the arts, was also published at the time. It was followed by the Letter about French Music, a pamphlet which praised Italian over French music and caused a great stir in Paris. Thus, within 3 years, Rousseau passed from relative obscurity to the summit of fame and controversy. During all this activity, his reflections on human nature and politics were being shaped into the argument of the Discourse on the Origin and Foundations of Inequality among Men, or Second Discourse. The program of personal reform he had adopted shortly after the publication of the First Discourse, and the new insights he acquired while writing the Second Discourse, now seemed to demand his withdrawal from Parisian society. During a visit to Geneva, he decided to return to the Protestant faith and take up his Genevan citizenship again. That visit to Geneva had been so pleasant, and his discontent with the affections of Parisian society was so intense that he almost decided to move to Geneva. However, the unfavorable reception of his Second Discourse in Geneva made him reconsider, and he joyfully moved into the little house in the forest of Montmorency, renovated for him during his absence by his good friend Meme de Pinay. Rousseau's decision to move to this house, the Hermitage, and thereby to remove himself from Parisian society, was generally disapproved by his friends. They refused to believe that anyone would voluntarily choose such solitude and accuse him of seeking only to enhance his reputation. But Rousseau was convinced that this was precisely the change he needed, and in later years he referred to the date on which he moved to the Hermitage as the period in his life when he truly began to live. Although lonely, these 6 years of voluntary withdrawal were productive. The long letter to M. Voltaire, 1756, criticizing his 2 poems about natural law and about the earthquake in Lisbon, the brilliant letter to M. d'Alembert about the theatre, 1758, the Julie or New Heloise, 1760, the Social Contract, 1762, and the Emile, 1762, were finished during this time. In addition, Rousseau made an extract of the works of the Abbé de Saint-Pierre and composed 2 long essays about the Abbé's political ideas. 1756, and also wrote his first autobiography in the form of 4 letters to M. le Président de Malesherbes, the letter to M. d'Alembert, and the new Heloise had tremendous success and sealed his reputation as a writer. However, while Rousseau was so busily engaged in his writing, his friends were occupied with gossip and rumors about him. He was accused of being neglectful and generally haughty, of hypocrisy and deceit. One series of misunderstandings led him to a rupture with Meme de Penay, and Rousseau's move from the Hermitage to the cottage belonging to the Prince de Condé at Mont Louise near Montmorency. Another series of misunderstandings led him to a break with his old friend Diderot, which he announced by means of clever footnote in the letter to M. d'Alembert, and for which was generally blamed. Still, all this was minor compared to the stem that followed the publication of the Emile, the book Rousseau considered to be his best and most useful work. Alerted during the night of June 8th to 9th, 1762, that the Parliament of Paris was about to condemn the Emile and issue a warrant of arrest against him, he hurriedly put his affairs in order and had barely taken flight toward Switzerland when the bailiffs of the court arrived to arrest him. The journey to Switzerland was uneventful. Rousseau was allowed to cross the border without any difficulties, and he went to the home of an old friend in Yverdon. But the easy crossing of the border was no harbinger of peaceful days in Switzerland. 2 days after his departure from Montmorency, the Emile was burned in Paris. A week afterward, both the Emile and the social contract were burned in Geneva. On July 1st, the government of Bern decreed that Rousseau must leave its territory. Fortunately, he was able to find a place of refuge in Moutiers. In November, Rousseau finished his letter to Christophe de Beaumont, a spirited and eloquent defense of the Emile against the condemnation the Archbishop of Paris had issued against that work. He then tried to defend Genevan republicanism and its Protestant basis, as well as himself, by replying to the letters écrites de la campagne, letters written from the countryside, with his own letters written from the mountain. Its appearance toward the end of 1764 occasioned new outbursts. The book was burned in The Hague as well as in Paris. The pastor of Moutiers attacked Rousseau from the pulpit, thereby inciting the populace against him, and in September 1765 Rousseau's house was stoned during the middle of the night. Forced to seek refuge elsewhere, he went to St. Peter's Island in the middle of Lake Bienne. See Fifth Walk. But the island was under the jurisdiction of the government of Bern, and after a stay of about 5 weeks he was ordered to leave the island immediately. Rousseau first considered going to Berlin, then changed his mind and accepted David Hume's invitation to go to England. Arriving in London early in 1766, he settled in the town of Wootton, which is not far from Birmingham. His stay in England was quite short and was punctuated by a bitter quarrel with Hume and an inexplicably angry exchange of letters with his host in Wootton, Richard Davenport. After about a year and a half in England, Rousseau suddenly returned to France. The following years were frenetic. After staying at Tyre, near Gisors in Normandy for a year, Rousseau moved to Grenoble on the Bourgogne midway between Lyon and Grenoble, and finally settled in the village of Monquin just outside Bourgogne. During these years of frenzy, Rousseau feared being recognized by the public and tried to disguise himself or to hide behind a false name. Teresa had accompanied him through all these troubled times since the flight from Montmorency. In 1768 they were married in Bourgogne. Somehow, despite the upset and turmoil, Rousseau was able to continue to write. The Confessions began in 1764, or 1765, was finished towards the end of 1769 or 1770. He returned to Paris in June 1770. Rousseau's real difficulties began with the period of voluntary withdrawal in the forest of Montmorency. Acclaimed as a great writer on the one hand, he was denounced as a scoundrel and an unsociable wretch on the other. He thought honestly, and virtue demanded that he act accordingly to his principles and shun the false conventions he scorned. But his friends and acquaintances accused him of hypocrisy and wickedness. Then, the book he considered to be his best, and certainly to be no different in substance from any of his other writings, was proclaimed to be destructive of the Christian religion and of all government everywhere. The judgment forced Rousseau to flee France and to be for a number of years at the mercy of the republican governments he had tried to defend. These governments banished him from one refuge after another. No sooner would he settle down than he would be forced to flee. These were trying experiences, and Rousseau did not always respond well to them. Sometimes he overreacted. At other times he seemed completely oblivious to the danger signals. But it was the apparent injustice of these tribulations that especially angered him. Here he was accused of precisely those things of which he considered himself most innocent, and others most guilty. Here he was not only accused, but actually punished, while the truly guilty went untouched. He could not attribute such injustice to pure coincidence, and thus came to the conclusion that he was the victim of a plot that some of his friends and many of his enemies had decided to bring him to an ignominious end. Two things might have things that might have moved them to such nefarious deeds: simple jealousy, or recognition that his passionate defense of unsophisticated virtue and republicanism undermined their own attempts to favor enlightened despotism. These conjectures, whose validity has recently been corroborated by scholars, haunted him for some time and prompted most of his strange actions during the difficult years of exile. They also dominated his mind in the years following his return to Paris. He spent a number of months writing the considerations about the government of Poland, and then turned to the sequel to the Confessions, the Dialogues. Started in 1772, this long work of self-explanation and justification was not finished until 1776. The Dialogues is a painful work to read, and Rousseau admitted that it had been quite painful for him to write. Occasional botanical forays and some music copying were the only activities that lightened his gloomy task. Otherwise, Rousseau kept to himself and suspiciously regarded every visitor as a spy for the leaders of the plot, as someone trying to keep him from finishing this important work. Somehow, with the termination of the Dialogues, the spell was broken. For a number of reasons, he was seized by a new spirit when he decided to begin the Reveries. Since the first and second walks are intended as an explanation of that new spirit, it seems fitting to return to the reveries at this point. The joys of finishing a book are many, but chief among them is that of acknowledging the assistance rendered by different people and institutions. I am very grateful for the discerning suggestions Anne Charney and Mary Poligny made about the translation. Their criticism and advice were invaluable. I owe much to the judicious remarks Philip Lyons made about the interpretive essay to Alan Seltzer's very thorough critique of the entire manuscript, and to Terence Marshall's criticisms as well as to the various comments and probing questions put forth by the friends who read and discussed this work with me during the winter of 1976. And I greatly appreciate the effort expended by Jean Sproul, Marta Tavaradek, and Lillian Foster in typing the various versions of the work. To enumerate the many ways in which my wife Deborah contributed to the project would be an almost endless undertaking. Suffice to say that she deserves to share the joys of seeing this finally come to an end. I would also like to acknowledge the generous assistance of the Department of Government and Politics as well as of the Graduate School of the University of Maryland and of Earhart Foundation for the financial aid which enabled me to pursue this project and facilitated the publication of this volume. While none of these persons or institutions can be held responsible for any shortcomings in the work, I hope that none will have reason to regret having helped bring it to the light of day. Charles E. Butterworth.